When preparing for a final exam, a key tool in your arsenal is going to be outlining. You should absolutely outline your course while you're still learning, while you're still studying, and you should also outline your exam answers. Now, I'll talk about outlining of your exam in a little while, but for now, let's focus on you outlining different rules while you're still studying during the duration of the course or during the duration of your preparations for the final exam. So if we take a look again at different rules we just saw in the CISG, we notice a certain pattern. We notice that these rules have different elements. And this is a very common thing in legal course, and this is a very common thing when it comes to legal rules in general. All the different rules will be able to be broken down into several different elements. You sometimes need to fulfill several different criteria in order for a certain rule to be met, or different exceptions might be applicable to different rules. So if we take a look once again at these two articles, you have to think of a way that you can summarize these articles for yourself. And if we tried doing that, here is what we could come up with. So we could make a short bullet list, a list of bullet points, which would say CISG is generally applicable. And then we would say A, if we have a contract, B, if that contract is for the sale of goods, and C, if the contract is concluded between parties who come from different countries which have signed CISG, which have ratified CISG. Furthermore, we can do the same with the Article 2. We can say that different exclusion criteria applies under the CISG for example, goods bought for personal use. CISG will not be applicable. But then we can write an exception from that rule. So this rule, this exception that CISG does not apply to goods bought for personal use, has its own exception. It does not apply if the seller had actual knowledge of the personal use. It also does not apply if the seller had an obligation to be aware of such a personal use. Now you can already see, even if I'm just talking about these things, even if we're just reading these rules, it can be very complicated. It can be difficult to keep track of all of these rules. So not only do you need to have an outline, but, and again, this is a key moment, for each point on your outline, you should make up an example. You need to write down an example which is going to illustrate this point for you moving on. So, for instance, here, when it comes to exclusion criteria for the CISG, I might say CISG does not apply if goods are bought for personal use. An example of that, and I will think of an example which is going to be vivid and which I'm going to remember. So I'm going to say, goods bought for personal use, fine. If I buy a toothbrush from Amazon, we do come from different contracting states. The goods are being sold. There is no doubt that there is a contract in question, but a toothbrush I've bought for personal use is excluded from the scope of application of CISG because it is clearly a personal item. And then when it comes to the exceptions from this rule, I also want to come up with some examples which illustrate these exceptions. For example, I might say CISG does not apply if seller had actual knowledge of personal use. If I told Amazon I'm going to use a camera I buy for personal use, that means that the application of CISG is excluded. Or in another example, if I tell someone I'm buying 500 racehorses for purely personal use, then they have actual knowledge of the personal use nature. And it's easy for me immediately to think of an example. When does someone have actual knowledge? Oh yeah, that time I told Amazon I'm buying a toothbrush, or that time I called someone and told them I'm buying racehorses, but they're all for my own personal use. Again, the more ridiculous the examples, the better, but you want to come up with something vivid, something you can remember. Your lecturers will usually try to use vivid examples during their lectures in order to get you to remember different elements of a rule. And then you want to, let's just finish with this particular example. Let's say a seller should have known, for example, of the personal nature of the or that the goods will be used for personal use. Well, an example there is a reasonable person in Amazon's position would have assumed that I'm purchasing a toothbrush for personal use. So again, you want to write as much as you can once you have this bullet point list or list of bullet points of different elements of legal rules. And once you have a document which looks like this, once you go through this document before your exam, it's going to be so much easier for you to revise. it's going to be so much easier for you to identify the problems on your final exam. Because this is how human memory works, right? We have this innate ability to recognize patterns. So this is what you need to push yourself to do. You need to illustrate different rules. You need to first break those rules into elements, but then you want to illustrate those elements so that your brain can recognize a pattern in the future. So now, every time I think of the applicability of the CSG, I'm going to remember, oh yeah, CSG did not apply to a toothbrush I bought from Amazon. And I swear to God, I never want to use this example again. But once again, you just want to kick off that pattern recognition process. So this is why outlining is immensely important. This is why when you're taking a legal course, you should start outlining as soon as you can, as early on as possible during the semester. You want to be making lists such as those. Now, if you can't come up, for example, with examples for some rules, talk to your classmates or ask your professor. So if I ever get a student who tells me, let's say we are in the data protection ethics class and we're learning about GDPR and we're learning about all of those privacy rules, which tend to be very technical in nature. If I ever get a student who asks me, can you give me an example? I will try to come up with, as I've said, as illustrative or as vivid of an example as possible. And if I can't do it on the spot, then of course, I will tell the student that I will reach out to them at a later stage. So outlining is the way to prepare for your legal exams. One more thing to note here is that outlining also works when you have theoretical questions in your exam. The pattern is slightly different, but again, you want to be taking notes while you're learning different theoretical concepts, and you want ideally to illustrate those concepts. So for instance, a purely theoretical question might be, in the context of international and commercial law, let's say, when different transnational sources are applicable and to which extent they are capable of preempting national laws. That might sound, again, very difficult to remember and to discuss, but if you take good notes, if you take notes in which you just write down some examples, then you will be able to answer that question immediately on the exam, because that example will just be the one thing you will remember and will kind of kick off the writing process for you. So that's how you should be preparing. Go through the contents of your course, find the legal rules, break them down into elements, and then illustrate different elements. And I think that's kind of the best kind of tip I have to give when it comes to the actual studying process. Remember to start early and remember to outline above everything else. So now that we've seen how important it is to outline, let's still talk a little bit about the exam. So what should you do when the exam actually starts? Maybe you are sitting there with your outline and you need to start writing, and now that's a whole different game than just actually studying and preparing for the exam. So how should you start? How should you kick off your writing process? Let's take a look.